Hello, 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 hello. How are you again? Thank you for stopping by and checking in on me to see what we got going on today. In this video, we're going to be talking about the second coming of Christ, and it's the year 2012, and December 21st is but a few days away. Today is December 18th, and a lot of people are concerned and worried about what's going to be taking place on December 21st, 2012. It's predicted that the world will suffer some kind of catastrophic event and be equivalent to this world coming to an end. But I want to speak on those things a little bit today and just give my thoughts and opinions on why we should not be worried about the world coming to an end, which is indicated in the Christian faith as the second coming of Christ. Because in all actuality, according to the scriptures in the Bible, I'm able to see where Christ has already returned to earth. The second coming of Christ has already happened, and it's recorded in the scriptures. And as I've been doing a lot of studying and a lot of reading, I've been able to see and just know for myself, and then balance those things and check those things against what I've been taught as a young child growing up in church and in accordance with what the Christian faith believes. And in this video, I just want to share a couple of those things with you. And maybe, who knows, you may be able to receive some kind of understanding and think things through a little bit differently than you previously had, and begin to do some research for yourself. So here we go. We'll talk about the second coming of Christ and what it is that the Christian church was looking forward to. And as a point, at the time that the second coming of Christ happened, we were not yet known as the Christian church. The Christian church did not become known as a Christian church until years later, until years later, after Paul had begun to go out and proclaim what had happened to him and the testimony that Jesus had given him. That's when Paul began to go out and minister, and the disciples would also go out and minister. And in Acts 11, the 11th chapter of Acts and the 26th verse, you'll see that the disciples, it says, and when he had found him, he brought, this is the 26th verse of Acts 11 and 26. It says, and when he had found him, he brought him in unto Antioch. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. And the disciples were called Christians first in Antioch. So you say, well, what's significant about that? It's all about the desire for man to have a name for himself, to make a name for himself. You often hear people talking about, I want to make a name for myself, or he made a name for himself by doing this, or they made a name for themselves by doing that. And since the beginning of time, man has been seeking to get his own identity, which is actually different from the identity that God had given man, which was simply children of God. So it's an issue with man to always try to receive some type of name for themselves, because in doing so, they lose the actual identity as what they lose the identity that God had given them, which is simply a child of God. I oftentimes say that we profess that we're children of God, not from a standpoint of selectiveness or being better than any other group, but it's simply to let others know that I'm a child of God, you're a child of God, we're all children of God, and you don't have to be jealous of me, nor do I have to be jealous of you, because our fathers are the same. And in realizing that we have the same Father, we're able to know that our Father will provide for us individually, because as I have 5 children, I know each one of my children's likes and dislikes, and I cater to those things as warranted. And God is the same with us. Even though there are several types of children, or God has several groups of children, if you allow me to say that, on earth, worshiping Him in different ways. We have to understand that we're all children of God, nevertheless, and God allows us to worship Him in the way that we see fit, because at the end of the day, we are all worshiping one God. So going back to the making the name, in Genesis, the 11th chapter and the 4th verse, you'll see where those ones were in that time saying, and they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." So that's when they were. That's when man was of one mind, and they began to cooperate together, and they built the tower. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. And so when God saw what they were doing or heard what they were doing, he came down to check on them. And in his checking on them, that's when he found that they were doing things that were not in accordance to the design that he had laid out, and he scattered them abroad upon the face of the earth and confounded their language. And so the same way that they were scattered in scattering them in Genesis, we'll see back in Acts where he brought them back together. So Genesis, you have the great scattering, but over in Acts, the second chapter of Acts, it talks about all of the devout men from every nation under the heavens were in one place and of one tongue again. So in Genesis, the 11th chapter, they were of one tongue in one place, but God scattered them because they were not sanctified unto him. They had begun to do things according to their own minds and their own thinking, so he confounded their language. But when Jesus came and died on the cross for our sins and rose from the grave, he brought them back in Acts on the day of Pentecost, and they were all of one tongue, all the men from many languages, and they were confused as to why they were able to understand one another. But we know that God does all things in accordance to his design and his plan. And so talking about the second coming of Christ and why I see that it's already happened, I'll take you over to First John, the book of John, the 20th chapter, and we'll start at the 16th verse. And in this story, we see where Mary had come. Jesus had been crucified and put in the grave, in the tomb, and Mary had come to check on the tomb. But when she got there, she noticed that the stone was rolled away, and there was a man whom she thought was a gardener standing at the tomb. And she turned to the gardener and asked, "Where did you place his body? Just tell me, and I'll take the body, but just tell me what you did with Jesus. He's special to me, and I want to ensure that his safety is intact." And when Jesus called out to her, you'll see in the 16th verse of the 20th chapter of John, it says, "Jesus said unto her," this is the King James Version, "When Jesus said unto her, Mary, she turned herself and said unto him, Rabboni," which is to say, Master. And in that moment, that's the first indication that the resurrection and the second coming of Christ has already happened. Well, you say that's the first. You may say to me, well, that's the first coming of Christ, and I'll say to you that absolutely it's not, because the first time that he came was through his mother Mary's womb. And when he entered into the world, the wise men knew that the Savior, the Messiah, had come, and they traveled far distances to celebrate the coming and the birth of Christ, which is actually what we celebrate on Christmas, December 25th. So we celebrate December 25th as the first coming of Jesus. And then over in the 20th chapter of John, and they're also recorded in other books. Matthew is one, for instance. In the 28th chapter of Matthew, the same event is recorded. But in the 20th chapter of John is the one I like to refer to. And then it says over in the 17th chapter that Jesus said unto her, John 20th chapter, 17th verse, Jesus saith unto her, Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended, that's ED, to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend, present tense, unto my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. And then it goes on to tell how Mary went and ran and found the disciples where they were, and she told the disciples of what Jesus had said to her. And then over in the 19th verse of that same chapter, the 20th chapter of John, in the 19th verse, you'll see, then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus and stood in the midst, and saith unto them, Peace be unto you. So here we have Jesus coming like a thief in the night, back for the to show the disciples that he indeed had risen, because he had told the disciples to just wait for me. And they were indeed waiting, and he came and he stood in the midst of them like a thief in the night. We oftentimes hear in the Christian church that Jesus is coming back like a thief in the night, and he's coming back for a church without a spot or a wrinkle. Well, that was confusing to me as a young child growing up, and also earlier in my adult life, to understand what that meant. But when God began to open up my understanding and show me these various scriptures, I automatically knew what was being said, but really not understood. Jesus indeed came back like a thief in the night, because he came and stood in the midst of the disciples who were, according to John 20:19, shut up in a place where the doors were shut because they were fearful of the Jews. The Jews were still persecuting anyone that was closely related to Jesus, because they weren't quite sure if they had crucified him and if they had actually gotten Jesus on the cross. So they wanted to have everybody that was in any part of Jesus's entourage, they wanted to make sure that they were dead too, just to be certain that they got Jesus and were successful in doing what they set out to do. So the disciples were locked up and they were huddled together, and here's Jesus coming to stand in the midst of them. And the only way that he got in there, well, no, they didn't know. They wondered how could you get in here? You didn't knock on the door, you didn't climb through the window, you didn't come down the chimney, because we have all those things secured. So how did you get in here, Jesus? It confounded and confused them. So the first thing Jesus said unto them was, "Peace be unto you." And he had to tell them, say, "Peace be unto you," because they were all the more frightened, because here is the Jesus that we just witnessed be crucified and put into a tomb, and now here you are standing before us, and we want to know how. You weren't here 2 seconds ago, and now you're here. How did you get here? So the first thing that Jesus had to do in order to get them to be able to receive what he was saying and understand those things was to declare peace upon them. And once he calmed their fears and declared peace upon them, then he delivered the message that he was sent with from God his Father and our Father. And then in the 20th verse of the 20th chapter of John 20:20, you'll see where he showed him his hands and his sides. The wounds in his hands and sides is what identified with. Oftentimes now we will identify Jesus with the cross, but Jesus simply identified himself with the hole in his hands and the wounds in his side. The cross indeed represents God, because at the beginning of time, when God declared to let there be light, at the beginning of Genesis, the first Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So when God created the heavens and the earth out of nothing, and these things came into be, that must have been a mighty, mighty sound. So you have a point where everything came out of nothing, and when that moment happened, you have to look at the light that came out of that as going vertically as well as horizontally, intersecting at a point which gives you a cross. And at that cross, in the center of that cross, was God in the beginning. But when man sinned, man took God out of the center of the cross and put himself as the focal point for their life. And so God was wanting to have himself back at the center and the focal point of all men's life, and that's why Jesus had to go to the cross in order to put God back at the center of it. And then once God was there in the center, through the death of Jesus on the cross, Jesus was removed from the cross, and we are now supposed to be focusing on God the Father, the Comforter, as the center of attention. And so we are still having Jesus as the center of attention when Jesus came to simply reconcile us back to the Father through his death and resurrection, thereby putting God back at the center of the cross. But today, since we as a Christian church and as a Christian body, most of us are still waiting for the second coming of Christ, we're still focusing on Christ, and thereby foregoing the benefits and the blessings that God has for us and for our life, by leading us into all things that he created us to be. We don't allow ourselves to be free enough to go into areas where we are not comfortable with, where religion has told us that we can't go, because we feel as if we haven't gotten the okay from Jesus or from God to begin to explore these unknown territories. But when you hear these directives come into your mind, it is for you to know that that's actually God that's talking to you and leading you into all truth and leading your path and guiding your footsteps. But because we have been told by the Jewish community of that day that Jesus hadn't returned, we are still waiting on the second coming of Christ. When Paul got his revelation from God, he began to understand what had happened, and he began to share those things with the ones that Paul came in contact with. But over in 2 Timothy, you'll see where Paul said that because of his message, he was being persecuted and held in jail, because the Jews, they did not want Paul to tell the Gentiles all that Jesus had done, because that to them was their controlling mechanism over the Gentiles, by declaring that they were better than everyone else in the world. Because as we know, the Bible records that the children of Israel, which are the Jews, were God's chosen people. Yes, they were, but that was for that time in the Old Testament when God was pulling them together to be an example to the world. But because they could never get it together and be that example that God wanted them to be, God had to send his son Jesus, and he died on the cross, thereby giving salvation to everybody, not just for the Gentiles, not just for the Jews, not just for the lineage that he came from. Jesus died once and for all. So Jesus came and he died, and the Jews thought that he was simply coming and dying for them. Jesus had it particularly hard when he came, because he was hated by two segments of the Jewish community. The Pharisees, which were the rulers of that day, which were the ones that were studying the gospel, studying the Old Testament, the Torah. They were the ones that were affluent and really versed in the law. They understood everything that needed to be done in order to be in connection with God, and they did those things to the best of their ability. However, they did not want if you will allow me to say this, the lower end of the Jewish community, the common Jews, to have the same access that the Pharisees had. So they did not allow the common Jews to study the law to the level that the Pharisees would study it. So when Jesus came and began to make the law applicable and available to everybody, all the commoners, the Pharisees had a particular problem with this, because their role was being diminished and being wiped out. So they set out against Jesus because of what Jesus was doing for the common people. But here's the other side to that. The commoners had also heard of the Messiah coming, and he was to be a great warrior. He was to be a great king, and he was to lead the revolt against the Roman army, who had Jerusalem captive at that time and Israel captive at the time. The Roman army was the invaders, if you will, and they were the rulers over that area, and they had the Jewish people oppressed. So the common Jews thought that Jesus would come and lead them in revolt against the Roman armies. And so when it was declared to Barabbas that Jesus was not going to lead the revolt or the charge in the way that he thought that they should, in the way that the commoners thought that Jesus should and would, that's when the commoners took issue with Jesus and began to revolt against him in that way as well. So Jesus had it from the Jewish community on both ends, and that's why they ultimately ended up killing him. One side, the Pharisees, killed him because of what he did with the law, making it available and achievable by all, and the commoners killed him and wanted him dead because they felt as if he was not who he said he was, based on the fact that he would not lead the charge in the war that they expected to be waged against the Roman armies. So that's why you have Jesus crucified on the cross. But then when Saul was converted to Paul, and Paul began to tell the good news, the gospel, to the Gentiles, to declare how they were entitled to the inheritance that the Jews now had because of Jesus' death, there you see the Pharisees and the rulers of the Jewish community began to imprison Paul to prevent the message from going out. And that same type of mentality, that same type of stipulations are being put on religion today. It's not being allowed for all men to understand that Jesus actually came back when he said he was, because we look at the Bible and we try to make the Bible fit the occurrences of today by just misinterpreting things. And the book of Revelation is a big stumbling block for a lot of people. But I believe that God will allow me to show and give me the wisdom on how to reveal that the book of Revelation took place in the 3 days that Jesus was gone from this earth. Because one of the main points that I'll draw from Revelation to prove that point is is Revelation's 1st chapter and the 3rd verse. It says, "Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written therein, for the time is at hand." The word "is" in the King James Version of the Bible is italicized, which is putting emphasis on that word. So if it's saying that the time is at hand for these things in Revelation to begin taking place, that's when those things were taking place, not now. They did not realize that we would be here in 2012. They thought that once Jesus came back, all of these things would have happened and the world would come to an end. So when the world did not come to an end, it's particular and it's for a reason, because God wanted to enjoy us as we were. So when we were in the way that we were, he began to minister to us and show us how we should live. So that's why I say that Jesus is not coming back. So take a break, relax. If you got any questions, let me know, and I'll get back with you. Reverend JT, signing out.